tonight. So I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, who is Greg Atkins. Greg was a university professor of science, brackets virology, I think you'll probably know that's to do with viruses, at Trinity College Dublin for 33 years until he retired and returned to the UK. He was born in London and educated at Liverpool University, which subsequently awarded him a doctorate of science. He lives near Yeovil in Somerset tonight, and a couple of hours ago I had a voicemail from him saying, I've just had a blowout outside Yeovil, I might be late, but actually the AA was absolutely brilliant this evening, and you can see he did get here in good time, so the AA have improved over the years. Okay, in Dublin, Greg was heavily engaged in teaching science to undergraduates and in research. He supervised 35 successful PhD students and 8 postdoctoral fellows. He's published 118 peer-reviewed papers, written and published a book, was member of 3 European research networks, coordinating one of them. He served on several EU and Irish government committees. He was a member of the Humanist Association of Ireland for many years, and on moving to the UK joined Humanists UK. He also joined Dorset Humanists. Actually, I think he has. Anyway, I haven't checked to see if he's paid a subscription, but I think he has. But he is a member of our schools team as well, and he does great work going to schools in surrounding counties, particularly helping young people who are doing GCSE, RE and philosophy to tell them about the humanist point of view. So, that was a bit of a long preamble, but I wanted you to know how eminent our speaker is tonight, so I'm delighted that he's here tonight to talk to us about evolution and morality. Will you please give a big welcome to Greg Atkins.
Well, thank you very much, David.
Do you want to take this, Greg?
I was just going to say, can anybody not hear what I'm saying? Put your hand up if you can't hear. I much prefer not to use a microphone, thank you.
Okay, then you've had your chance.
Yes, if anybody can't hear while I'm speaking, put your hand up and I'll go and use the microphone. Tonight, well, first of all, I want to say a big thank you tonight to the AA, who got me here on time after a blowout. Very impressive, they were there in 20 minutes. Okay, I want to talk to you tonight about ethics and morality. Now, I've actually given this a similar talk before, and I see 1 or 2 people who were at that talk. So I'm going to repeat some of what I said, but not all of it. You'll get a bit extra tonight. And you are banned from participating in the audience participation because you know the answer. Right? Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about ethics and morality, and that's usually, you'll say, the preserve of philosophers. Philosophers talk a lot about ethics and morality, but I'm going to do something different. I'm going to give you a scientific analysis of ethics and morality, and it might help for you to see where I'm coming from, to tell you how I got into this in the first place. About 5 years, possibly, no, it was 6 years before I retired, there was a vacancy, a teaching vacancy at Trinity. And now, I don't know how you know, whether you know how academics operate, but they usually don't like teaching, or they don't like extra teaching. They do research, and that's what they think their be-all and end-all is. But I'd done my first degree in genetics. This vacancy was to teach evolution to first-year students. And I'd done my first degree in genetics and my PhD, but then I did my PhD on the genetics of viruses, so I diverged and became a virologist. But when I did my degree, genetics was quite different to the way it is today. And so I actually volunteered. I did something completely unheard of. It's like being in the army, being in academia. You don't volunteer for anything. So, but I actually volunteered for this because I wanted to see how genetics had caught up. So I volunteered to give 8 lectures to first-year students on evolution. And I looked at what my predecessor had done, and it was pretty standard stuff. And I thought, how can I make this a little bit more interesting? How can I put in things that maybe they hadn't heard of before? And I came across evolutionary ethics. I don't know how I came across it, but when I came across it, it was part of philosophy, obviously. And I thought, I wonder if I could put that into a science course. So I thought about it and did a little bit of reading, and I thought, yes, that would fit in very well, and it might interest them as well. So I looked at it a bit more, and something came across to me very quickly, and that is that there are two branches in this subject, and they don't speak to each other, basically. There's the philosophy branch and the science branch. Philosophy branch publishes books and writes in philosophical journals, and the science branch mostly publishes in science journals or psychology journals, and the two don't meet, and sometimes they even break out into open warfare. There's been a slagging match going on for quite a long time between Richard Dawkins, who identifies as a scientist, and Michael Ruse, who identifies as a philosopher. They're both atheists, as you probably know, but it ended up with Michael Ruse telling Richard Dawkins to grow up and learn some philosophy. Stephen Hawkins has also put his, when he was alive anyway, put his two pennies in. He said that philosophy is out of date and should no longer be taught, especially in universities, because it's ideas without evidence. Those were his words. Now, evolutionary ethics, what I'm going to talk about tonight, is not ideas without evidence. There's a huge amount of evidence for the concepts in evolutionary ethics. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to first of all talk a little bit about evolution in general, just to set the scene. Then I'm going to go on to talk about what the main principles of evolutionary ethics are. And I'm very much going to do this from a science point of view. Now, since I retired, I've been dabbling in philosophy. I actually run a U3A philosophy group, but I don't really understand it very well. So what I'm going to say is mainly orientated towards science. And then what I'm going to do is show you some of the evidence. And the evidence, unlike most areas of philosophy anyway, is both observational and experimental. So I'm going to go through 5 lots of experiments just to show you the kind of data that's been used to come to the conclusions that people have come to. Okay, so let's... this is, David talked about this person actually. Evolution is, I heard him in a talk he gave on Islamic scholars, or Islam, was it? I don't know how, I found this picture on the internet, but I don't know how anybody ever got a picture of him because he lived in the 13th century. But the idea of evolution is quite an old one. It's actually Aristotle and some other Greek philosophers talked about it in a kind of vague way. But this man was the first person to come up with a comprehensive theory of evolution. Now what I'll put at the bottom there, just summarise what he wrote, and it was, from what the knowledge that people had then, it was really almost spot on. He said that elements evolved into minerals, then plants, then animals, then humans, and he even postulated that hereditary variability was an important factor in biological evolution. So if you went to school in Iran, you'd be told that this was the guy who invented evolution, not Darwin. But what he didn't do was come up with a mechanism. He didn't come up with any mechanism, he didn't come up with any evidence either, or not much anyway. So we fast forward a bit to this guy, Thomas Robert Malthus, I think he used to call himself Robert Malthus actually, he labelled himself a philosopher, but he came up with this idea about what would happen when as human populations grew. What he said was that human populations will increase. Yeah, you can't hear. Okay. All right, I'll use the microphone. Okay, so can you hear now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so what he said was that human populations would grow unchecked and that they grow exponentially, which is more or less what happened in his time. That's not the case now, but what this will result in is available resources being exhausted, and there'll be a struggle for survival, and those who survive will be the best able to compete for resources. So this was kind of a mechanism of competition, but he only applied this to humans. He said that basically the fittest humans, the ones that would be the ones that would survive, those who could compete best. So these two ideas of evolution and the mechanism of natural selection were in place before Darwin appeared on the scene. It wasn't actually just Darwin, it was a paper published by somebody else called Alfred Wallace. Darwin was big enough to recognise that he wasn't the only person who came up with this idea. Alfred Wallace came up with it at the same time, so they published the paper together. So he published this research paper in 1858, which put a mechanism on evolution. It said that animals and plants evolved, like Catuzzi said, but they evolved because Malthus's mechanism operated. In other words, they evolved because there was a struggle for survival and the fittest would survive. But he actually didn't say survival of the fittest. He came up with a mechanism, he didn't use those words. So in in 3 more books, he expounded on this. Everybody knows about On the Origin of Species and the Descent of Man. You perhaps don't know so much about this one, which was his last book. And what he did here, he came very close to dealing with human behaviour, because he talked about evolution of emotions in man and animals. So Darwin came close to it, and after he died and was buried in Westminster Abbey, okay, I haven't got the slide that I meant to put in here. Okay, we'll skip that anyway. Evolution is usually too slow to observe directly. There are a few instances where you can see it directly. For example, there's a melanic moth that evolved during the Industrial Revolution, because all the you know about the peppered moth. I can see somebody that's actually, if I go into it, that's actually quite a spurious example. It's not what they think it is. But anyway, influenza virus in my field evolves very rapidly. You have to have a different vaccination every year against influenza virus, because it changes by evolution, by countering the human immune system. So you can see it's very occasionally, but usually it's much too slow to trace directly. There are 2 ways. The original method, of course, was from fossils. Fossils show that evolution occurred, but there are big gaps in the fossil record, and of course creationists and people who believe in intelligent design have seized on this and said that, okay, there wasn't really an evolution here because there's a big gap. Although they've ignored it, this kind of let out, or this kind of excuse, was stopped by DNA sequence analysis. nowadays, the first human genome took 12 years and 18 different laboratories to discover or to find the sequence of the first human. Now you can do it in about an hour, and there are very many animals and plants now that have been sequenced, probably, well, at least thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. And it's going on all the time, more and more genomes are being sequenced. You can tell from the sequencer, by comparing the sequences of DNA, you can tell how closely related animals and plants are. So, for example, our genome is quite different from the genome of plants and bacteria, although there are some similarities. If you look at our genome, we share 98% of it with the chimpanzee, and that's our nearest relative. Even 95 or over 90% is shared with the mouse, so a mouse is quite closely related to us. But as you go down the evolutionary tree, the similarity gets less and less. So this is a much better way of showing that evolution occurred than fossils, much more definitive evidence. Of course, there are some people who are creationists and believe in intelligent design and still don't accept this, but I think it's very, very clear. I don't know what, I just show you this because did all of you, well, some of you went on the outing to Cambridge, to the Fossil Museum. I took this photograph there. This is their pride and joy, an ichthyosaur. So it's an example of a fossil. And so this was a dinosaur which took the ecological niche that dolphins take now. So it's an example of a fossil. DNA sequence analysis. What you do is to first translate the DNA to a protein sequence. The technicalities don't matter, but you can do an alignment and you can show that DNA from different organisms, how closely related it is. So that's by far the most definitive evidence. So you can show a tree of evolution starting from the beginning of life. We don't actually know how that happened, but through an evolutionary gradation to man. We always put humans at the pinnacle of evolution, but I wonder really whether we should. Different question. This, of course, is part of something much bigger. It's part of cosmic evolution, which is the changing of the universe, and even perhaps beyond that, what happened to bring about the Big Bang might come into it as well. But so it's part of a much bigger picture of evolution. Okay, that's just a refresher on what evolution is all about. Question then is, when am I going to come to morals and ethics? Before I do, being a scientist, I want to know about precise definitions. So we've got two words here. We've got the word morals, and we've got the word ethics. So the question is, what's the difference between the two? Well, if you read quite a lot of the literature, especially the philosophical literature, they seem to use those two words interchangeably. If you look it up in a dictionary, morals are rules that you make up for yourself, and ethics are rules that are imposed on you. So that's what the dictionary says, but to be honest, if you read the literature, there's a great deal of interchanging of the two words. Anyway, we all know that the human brain got bigger as evolution occurred, that we evolved from ape-like animals, and that our brains grew. Our brains also grew in function. Not only did they grow in size, but the way we use our brains became much more and more sophisticated. I think everybody will realise that. But, okay, let's take an example of evolution that everybody probably knows about, which is that giraffes evolved from deer. And deer eat grass on the ground, giraffes eat leaves high in trees. And there must have been a progression from the deer that was eating grass and the giraffe that was eating leaves. And of course its neck got longer by evolution because it was able to reach up higher and higher to leaves. That's the structure. Its long neck is the structural adaptation. But its function also changed. It changed its diet from eating grass to eating leaves. And that's a behavioural change. Now let's just look at then what's the human brain. We know, of course, that its anatomy has changed, and we know that it's very sophisticated function. But there's absolutely no reason why the functioning of the human brain shouldn't have evolved in parallel to the structure of the human brain. And that's really the basics of evolutionary ethics, is what happened to the function of the human brain, how did our behaviour develop, and why did it develop, and particularly why did our moral behaviour develop the way it did. All right, so what's happened then?
Can I have a go?
There's the one I was looking for. It's all right, fine. Yeah. All right. This was the slide I thought was earlier on, actually. This guy, Herbert Spencer, he was a contemporary of Darwin. And again, he labelled himself as a philosopher. He thought of himself as a philosopher. Now, he was interested in this business of behaviour. He wanted to explain how human morals came about. And he was probably Darwin's #1 fan. Well, no, perhaps Thomas Huxley was, but he was certainly in there anyway. So he wanted to apply it to philosophy. So he was really the father of evolutionary ethics. And he put forward the idea that he was the first person to put forward the idea that morals and ethics have evolved in order to enhance survival. And of course, Darwin was, at that time, was dealing with individuals. He was dealing with what he thought were the evolution of individuals. And a big problem cropped up then. And this problem lasted for the whole, almost 3/4 of the 20th century. Herbert Spencer's ideas were kind of debunked, both by scientists and philosophers. And the reasoning went like this, that if you've got a very selfish individual in a population, one who does everything from the point of view of themselves, goes about stealing, perhaps goes about murdering fellows in society, does everything that's wrong, they say, well, that guy's really got that guy or woman has really got a chance here. That's the one who's going to survive, and somebody who does everything for everybody else and forgets about themselves, they're not going to survive. So that was the argument that was used to debunk Herbert Spencer's ideas, and it really was quite effective for a long time. People thought that morals and ethics, no, they couldn't arise through evolution because of that particular objection. Now, you all know this guy. He wrote what I think is a much more significant book than the God Delusion. He wrote a book called The Selfish Gene in 1976. And actually, if that book had been original, he would have got a Nobel Prize, but of course he hasn't got a Nobel Prize. And the reason he hasn't got the Nobel Prize is because it wasn't his idea. He got it from the scientific literature. But what he said was, he made a very important distinction between genes and individuals. What he said was that even the selection which produces evolution doesn't act on individuals, it acts on genes. It acts on genes within those individuals, and in particular when you look at in particular when you look at populations, it acts on the gene pools in those populations. So this book, there was the centenary came a couple of years ago, and it was republished, a book called The Selfish Gene. Now, let me just show you how this might change the way people think about morals and ethics. If you're living in a situation where your relatives are close to you, somebody has the same genes as you do, or nearly the same genes, and you ensure the survival of that person as well as yourself, then you're ensuring the survival of two lots of genes, not just one. And that's a simple way of doing it, but it works in a much more complex way. It works in chain reactions, in chains, and in branches. So if you are doing things that are going to ensure the survival of your genes in a population, then those genes are much more likely to survive. If you're doing things for people who've got the same genes as you, you're making your genes survive. So it doesn't apply to individuals. So that was Dawkins' idea, and it was very significant in terms of what evolutionary ethics is all about, particularly the scientific side of evolutionary ethics. So I just said that it was the gene is the raw material of evolution, not the individual. So he also advanced another idea, and this was a bit more dubious. I don't know whether anybody's read The Selfish Gene, but he advanced another idea. He's said that patterns of behaviour can be inherited in the same way as genes. And this, of course, might apply to moral behaviour, and are subject to natural selection. Now, this came a cropper. People have labelled it as pseudoscience. He called these things memes, and there was, at the time, a science developed around this idea called memetics. But really, it didn't survive. And the reason it didn't survive was because there is no structural equivalent, no anatomical equivalent of a meme. You can't find what it is, but you do know what a gene is. It's a piece of DNA. So this idea kind of died a death, but it's, as you'll see in a minute, it's resurfaced. It's resurfaced in a different way because it's resurfaced in the form of learned behaviour. So that's what Richard Dawkins, in a nutshell, put in his book, and he advanced across a lot of discussion and evidence about that. So, what is the fact? I'll just tell you to begin with what the main tenets of evolutionary ethics are, and then I'll go on to describe some of the evidence. Of course, I can't describe all of it, but I'll give you an idea anyway. All right, so first of all, one thing you've got to really think of, which is that we have spent something like 95% of our existence as a species as hunter-gatherers, and before that, the species which evolved into Homo sapiens, they were hunter-gatherers too. So in terms of what the way that anything has evolved really, especially morals and ethics, you've got to think about what happened in a in a hunter-gatherer society. It doesn't matter what happened in our society because we've only existed as civilised societies for 10,000 years. We've spent 190,000 years as Homo sapiens and a long time before that as the species that evolved into Homo sapiens. So you've got to think about what happened in what would happen in a hunter-gatherer community. So in its extreme form, evolutionary ethics says that moral behaviour has survival and reproductive advantages for genes, not just necessarily for individuals. There are objections to this, but I'll come on to them in a minute. Particularly a lot of objections from philosophers, but anyway, I'll come on to that. First of all, in a hunter-gatherer society, and perhaps also to a certain extent in our own society, the people that are closest to you are likely to be your relatives. In other words, people who've got the same genes as you have. So, in a hunter-gatherer society, the people that any individual would come across in everyday life would be the people that have their genes. So that's the first idea. So the other thing is what I talked about the branching and the fact that the survival of genes in populations is more than just between two individuals. If I, for example, do something moral that will enhance the survival of the genes in somebody next to me, it could be that person doesn't reciprocate to me, reciprocates, or he or she reciprocates to somebody else. That might go round in a circle, but eventually come back to me. So a whole lot of us have got a survival advantage. And also you can see it branching and coming back in that way. So you can build up really complicated networks of people behaving in a way to each other that would enhance survival of genes. So it's not just the first person you meet. So this is Michael Ruse, who I mentioned just now. What he says is that, I just put a quotation there from his book, to make us cooperate for our biological advantage, evolution has filled us full of thoughts about right and wrong. So that is the basic idea of evolutionary ethics. Ideas of right and wrong come from evolution, and they're there because they enhance the survival of genes, not individuals, genes. So that is the basic principle of what evolutionary ethics is all about. So what you can say, deriving from that, is that all morals have a survival advantage for the individual, the social group, but particularly for the gene pools in that group. Now, there's an important distinction to be made here between absolute morals, which is what the basic pattern of behaviour is, and the way they're actually expressed. And I'll come on to how that might be in a second. But morals almost always are not absolute. I'll give you a couple of examples. You shouldn't kill people. That's a basic moral. You don't go murdering other people. That's wrong. On the other hand, the soldier can murder people. He's allowed to. So that's conditional. Another rule is that monogamy. You pair off with somebody and that is considered the right thing to do because that's the way you have offspring. But in our society, 50% of all marriages end in divorce. So that's conditional as well. And there are many other examples of that. They're not morals are not absolute, they're conditional. The other thing, and this is where I get into real trouble when I talk for the U3A and in schools, that morals are reinforced by religion. And religion is a mechanism for enforcing morals, so you can say that it has survival value itself. All right, now what I'm going to do now is to there's a huge amount of scientific data to back up evolutionary ethics. And what I'm going to do is to give you 5 examples of experiments and data that have been used to draw conclusions about evolutionary ethics. I can't give you the full amount of data because there's a huge amount of it, and to be honest, some of it is very complex and very difficult to understand. I find it difficult to understand, particularly the kind of psychological experiments that are used in showing principles of evolutionary ethics. But I'll show you some simple data and some simple experiments. Now, there might be people who are maths buffs in the audience, so I'm just going to define what I mean first. When I use the word usually here, what I mean is that it's statistically significant. In other words, it has 95% probability. So it's something that occurs 95% of the time, in other words. So we're not talking about things that happen all the time. If I use the word often, it means something that occurs most of the time but is not significant, is not statistically significant. Most of you can ignore that. That's just in case there are maths people in the audience who are going to try and catch me out. Okay. So, this is the first experiment I want to consider. And then I must say that this experiment was done 30 years ago, and it wouldn't be done today. Okay, so first of all, this experiment was done on rhesus monkeys. Rhesus monkeys are social animals that live in social groups, and they have a very distinct hierarchy to the group. They live in small social groups, but they're also used as you all probably know, as experimental animals. So, in this experiment, newborn monkeys were taken from their mothers at birth and hand-reared in isolation. In other words, they weren't given any opportunity to interact with other monkeys. When adult, an experiment was set up with these single monkeys, which were housed in wire cages within full view of each other. Pairs were set up so that one monkey from each pair received a painful electric shock every time another one fed, and the monkeys could see each other. So what happened then? The feeding monkey would usually eventually refuse to feed and starve itself. So rather than inflict an electric shock on the other monkey. So this is clear evidence that that monkey has got a regard for the other monkey. It's showing a very basic moral behaviour. As I say, this experiment wouldn't be allowed now because rules on animal experiments have been tightened. But I just want to, well, the conclusion from this is that obviously that the monkeys have an innate sense of empathy for other monkeys. So that sense of empathy in the monkeys was probably present in our precursor species. It hasn't just come with humans. Okay, what I want you to think now is, what was your reaction to that experiment? Did you have to think about it? And I'll come back to this in a minute. So did you have to think about what your reaction to that experiment was? I'll come back to that in a minute. All right, this is a different experiment. This is an experiment on children. As far as I know, you're not allowed to give electric shocks to children, but this is an experiment with 2-year-olds. In this experiment, 2-year-old children are placed in a bare room with just a chair, and then an adult comes in, sits in the chair for a while, completely motionless, and the child is in the room, and drops a scarf on the floor. The result and stays motionless after they've dropped the scarf. The child will usually ignore the scarf. The adult then reaches for the scarf, very obviously, and then sits back in the chair again, in full view of the child, but it doesn't pick it up. The child will usually pick up the scarf and actually hand it to the person who's sitting in the chair. So that's an experiment which shows the same thing in very young children, 2-year-old children. These children already have this sense of empathy for other humans. They didn't learn it, in other words, it's within them. Okay, it's another one. Learned patterns of behaviour. Children are told a story. Well, they're told first of all that Bob has to wear a hat outside, and then they're shown drawings or images of 4 drawings of Bob. Drawings of Bob in a house with a hat, drawings of Bob in a house without a hat, and then drawings of Bob outside of the house without a hat and having the hat blown off by the wind. And then they're asked to pick what image shows who was the naughtiest in those drawings. What happens depends on the age of the children. Children over the age of 4 will usually pick up the image of Bob outside of the house with no wind. So they'll say that that's the naughtiest behaviour. Younger children will choose an image randomly. They won't pick any one in particular. So you can see here there's a threshold in these children of, I picked age 4 because this is about when the threshold occurs. Children can learn moral behaviour around the age of 4. Prior to that, they don't learn it, they just have their innate moral behaviour. So these children have, once they're 4, they can learn after being told what's right and wrong. So they learn their behaviour patterns from what they're told. And they remember that, whereas the younger children can't do that. Okay, let's get on to the 4th one then. Once they've learnt these patterns of behaviour, how do they apply them? Okay, another experiment. Children are told 2 sentences. Jack tells Jill how to get to his house, but Jill gets lost and can't find it. Second one is, Janet tells Bill the wrong directions to her house, but Bob finds it anyway. So, children are asked, who's the naughtiest? Who's the naughtier, Janet or Jack? And again, you see this threshold of around the age of 4, that children up to the age of about 4 will choose randomly. They won't have any preference for who had the naughtiest behaviour. But if you go beyond the age of 4, 4-year-olds, they will usually say that Janet has behaved the naughtiest. So you can see here, this is just to illustrate the progression and the distinction between 2 forms of behaviour. To illustrate the distinction between innate behaviour, what's within us, and the way we behave, if you like, automatically, what's programmed into us, and what we learn from other people. And the learning threshold is around the age of 4. So, what they've learnt beyond the age of 4 is that Janet is lying, and that they make a moral judgment that lying is wrong. So they're making a moral judgment there that she's not telling the truth. And that's wrong. Now, I want to do an experiment on you. Now, people from the philosophy group are not allowed to answer this because you know the answer. Well, where's the other microphone?
We got the electric shocks ready.
All right. What I want to ask you, not you, you don't answer it. What I want to ask you is, what do you think the object of punishing criminals is? What do you think the objective is?
Revenge.
And anybody wants to give an answer?
Revenge.
As a deterrent, stop them doing it
Somebody
again.
said deterrent over there. Okay. Anybody got any other ideas?
Revenge.
Yes, you've got the right answer, but anybody got any other ideas?
No, hands up at the back.
Two at the back there.
Deter the rest of us from doing it?
Yes, deterrent. Anybody?
Yeah, I was going to say to act as a deterrent or for the other
Yeah,
person.
somebody else has got an idea here.
I think someone said retribution.
Sorry?
Retribution.
Yes. Okay. You're obviously very intelligent, because you messed up the experiment. But
So I was thinking it's maybe a kind of reverse empathy. So just as, we confuse our own identity with other people who are similar, so maybe, we feel guilty, so by empathy, so we want that person to be punished.
wow, that's a very complicated answer. Nobody's given me the other one that I usually get in schools, but is it?
To correct behaviour.
Ah, that's the one. Okay, when I do this in schools to sixth formers, they usually only give me two answers. They think, and then they say, it's to deter the criminal, and then somebody else will say, oh no, that's not right. You should reform the criminal. That's what punishment is all about. In fact, somebody gave me what it's really about, and that's.
No, they didn't.
Didn't they? I thought they did.
No, they didn't.
Somebody said revenge, didn't they?
Well, that's not what it's really about. Peter, take the mic.
Sorry,
Take the mic.
I say revenge.
I think it's a mistake to think that punishment has a single purpose. I think reform, retribution and deterrent are all in the mix, and probably a couple of other things as well. To try to isolate one of them as the one is a mistake.
Okay. You've given me a very educated reply there, and a very argued reply. Obviously you're using your consciousness a lot to answer that question. If you do psychological experiments on people, the experiment's actually quite complicated, but I'll give you an example of what it's all about in a minute. It's actually revenge. Yeah. It's actually retribution. That's what the basic reaction is. These other ideas of deterrent and reforming the criminal, they come from your head. They don't come from within you. They're not innate reactions. What it comes from is that humans, like all other animals, have a survival instinct, and if somebody attacks you, or another animal attacks an animal, you want to fight back, and you want to harm that animal. You want to stop it harming you by harming that animal. And there's an emotion also that comes into it, anger. These basic innate moral reactions are always, nearly always anyway, not always, nearly always enforced by an emotion. Now this gentleman here and other people in the audience were giving me a highly sophisticated reason why you should punish criminals, or maybe that's what you should do in a civilised society. You should think like that. That's not what our basic reaction is. Now, you can see this almost every day, actually. I was watching a news programme today, and the lady who'd been raped by Bill Cosby was on the news, and she just heard that Bill Cosby had been given I don't know how much, he got a prison sentence anyway, and she was saying how satisfied she was, how relieved she was, and how this really meant that she could now get on with her life. So she was basically saying she wants retribution. I also, some time ago, saw the victims of Srebrenica after Mladic was convicted and given a life sentence. The way they reacted was exactly the same way. They're saying, oh, we can get along with our lives now, we're satisfied, we feel relieved now that this guy has been punished. So that is the basic reaction. That's what's coming from your innate reaction. The other things come from up here. They come from consciousness. They don't come from basic reaction.
Excuse me. If you went back far enough, you would kill them and you would take their genes out of the pool.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
you take their genes out, wipe them out.
That is another modification of morals, because in this country, some years ago, and still in the United States, you could kill people as retribution. And even Muslim countries, you could do it for adultery. So, yes, of course. That's a modification of a moral reaction. Yeah. Anyway.
I'm really unhappy about this because what you...
Take the mic, that's all right, just take the mic so everyone can hear. That's all right.
So, yeah, I think what you've done here, you asked us the question, what do we understand by punishment? And then you've told us that what essentially you've done is equated punishment with revenge or retribution, and that's somehow the real meaning of punishment. But punishment is a richer concept than retribution. And
Absolutely.
I think to try to just pull it down and say, this is the real meaning...
I'm going to come on.
You are
jump in the gun.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to come on to that. You're absolutely right. What you've done there is to modify your basic reaction. And that is completely justified, completely right in a civilised society. What I'm trying to get at is what the basic reaction is, okay? And I'll come on to the way, what you're saying in just a second. Okay, so, all right, so these are the three reasons for punishment that I usually get anyway. So, from the viewpoint of reason, which is exactly what you were doing, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. Of course, it's absolutely right. It's what we do as civilised human beings. Absolutely. But it's not our basic reaction, okay? It's... Now, I can't... Yeah?
I don't know about other people, but I can't read.
All right. All right, I'll read it out. 3 models of punishment: 1, deterrence; 2, reform of behaviour; 3, just deserts or retribution, which is what we've just been through. And from the viewpoint of reason, people opt for numbers 1 or 2, or actually something even more sophisticated, like this gentleman and the gentleman over there, of course. Psychological experiments, usually set up as games, will always show that people are after revenge, they're after retribution, that's what their basic reaction to punishment is. So the emotion of anger is what's reinforcing this. So anger this is Darwin's idea actually, has also arisen by evolution to reinforce these moral judgments and survival of social groups. Now, we're going to have a field day now because I'm going to tell you what the objections are, what people have come up with. One that I nearly always get, and I'm talking about schools here, not sophisticated people like you, is that, how do you explain altruism? And they often tell me the story of the priest in the concentration camp who volunteered to give up his life in exchange for a family man. He volunteered to be shot instead of somebody who had a wife and family. So how do you explain that kind of altruism? Easy to deal with actually, but the other two aren't too easy to deal with. Charitable giving, how do you explain the fact that you might give money to people in Africa and that's because you've made a moral judgment? How do you explain that? I'm not sure, and I've got to say I'm not sure. Go back to the experiment with the monkeys. How many people felt abhorrence to that experiment? And did you have to think about what your reaction was? No. So you could say that you're regarding the monkeys as other human beings. I don't know, but you could say also that regard for animals, cruelty to animals, isn't going to enhance your survival. Okay, so that's another objection that people have come up with.
Can I just sorry. On the charitable giving thing, it's easy. I think we do get something out of ourselves, don't we? I'll say it's very easy on the charitable giving to think that we're just doing it because it's all for somebody else. But if we're actually truthful, I think actually we feel good giving to charity because hey, I'm being the good guy.
Yeah, but I'm asking why. Why do you feel good? Why do you do it at all?
Because guilt. No, I don't. I think because you feel. It doesn't mean you feel big. Maybe that's superiority or something. You're doing something good, and actually it's quite nice to tell people you've done it. And hey, I've got this thing coming out. Money coming out. Yeah, I go and give blood. Now, I don't know who it goes to, but hey, it's good to be able to say, hey, look, I've got between.
Exactly the point I'm making. The points I'm making is that I can't give you all the answers. This isn't
all I'm saying is I think it's not, with a charitable thing, we do gain something ourselves as well.
Yeah, but not in terms of what I'm saying, not in terms of survival of your genes. The lady at the back. We are going to have questions at the end, but I haven't got much longer to go, so.
It's okay, I have a very loud voice.
Fun?
I have a very loud voice. Don't all those three things though join in with the monkey showing empathy? If you said that the monkey showing empathy is innate behaviour, isn't this just
so what you're okay? Yeah, I think that's probably quite a reasonable idea. Is that what you're saying is you're regarding all these people as being your fellow human beings. Yeah, even animals.
Monkeys, it doesn't object to it fits in.
Yeah, I agree. That's one possible explanation, but I can't come up. What I'm saying is I can't come up with the scientifically sound explanation for this, and so I'm just showing you these are the sort of objections that philosophers have come up with. The first one actually is easy to deal with because we're talking about what happens with 95% probability. We're not talking about what happens in rare instances, less than 5% of the time. So that's easy to deal with. But the other two aren't so easy to deal with. Right. So I'm just getting, what's the time now? I'm getting to the end. So this is nearly the end. This is really the conclusions of evolutionary ethics from a scientific point of view. That moral behaviour occurs in three layers. We've got this innate and instinctive behaviour that you see in children, you see in the monkeys. They are not learned, but they're controlled genetically. There's some very obvious examples of this. The sex drive, fright and flight in response to danger, the maternal instinct. They can all be modified, but they are not things that you think about. They're things that are within you, and they actually come from your genes. You can show by the kinds of experiments that I've showed you that these are innate in humans. They're really genetic. They're not thought about, and they're not learnt. All right. Next layer is the layer that quite close to what Richard Dawkins originally said, but not exactly, because we're not saying that the next layer of pattern behaviour, we're not saying that it's directly inherited from one generation to the next or from one individual to the next. What we're saying is that more likely than not, these learned patterns of behaviour are enclosed within a social group, enclosed within a society, and they're subjected to natural selection. They're not genetic, they're learnt. They're the kinds of behaviour I showed you in the 4-year-olds, where they learnt a pattern of behaviour, but nevertheless that could be subjected to natural selection for those patterns of behaviour can still be selected for. they sometimes modify innate behaviour. But the third kind is what this gentleman here was just indulging in, and what the gentleman at the back was just indulging in: conscious thought and reasoning. You modify these other two patterns of behaviour by conscious thought and conscious reasoning. This might also have been the subject of natural selection. That's a moot point. But you don't always go along with your learned patterns of behaviour or your innate genetic patterns of behaviour. Sometimes you modify them, and that's what we do sometimes in civilised societies. We use our reason. Question is, how often do we do this? How often do we go along with innate patterns of behaviour, or learnt patterns of behaviour that we don't think about, or how often do we use our consciousness to modify these innate patterns of behaviour? As far as I know, there's only guesses on this and no data. So we've come to the end of what real science would tell us. I can give you a couple of people's guesses. Michael Ruse, who I mentioned, he says at a guess that it's around 20% of the time. Daniel Dennett, who's more of a scientist, I suppose, than a philosopher, would say less than 10%. But what all people that are in this field and looked at this field are agreed on is that it's a minority. Usually we go along with innate or learned patterns of behaviour that we don't think about. So, we have to bring in now, seeing as we're humanists, the sore subject of religion. Religion reinforces morals. So, that's one thing it does. It does other things as well. I'm not going to go into the other things it does, but this is one thing that it does. It enforces moral behaviour. And if you look at what's considered good moral behaviour in societies throughout the world, there are differences, but it's remarkably similar. The things that are considered right and things that are considered wrong are remarkably similar. And every society has a religion, and the religion reinforces that. So we can say that in this particular aspect, religion is itself being subject to natural selection because it's reinforcing something else which is advantageous. Okay. Right, I've finished now. I hope you all have got the idea now that there's much more to these things than meets the eye, and that we have much less control over the way we behave than we think. And anybody who wants to read up about this, I'll just put these on. These are two books that I've seen that I think are quite good. The first one is really a good introduction. The other one is much more complicated, but it did come out last year, so it's quite up to date. So if anybody wants to read about this, you can read about them here. Okay, finished.
Thank you very much, Greg. So we've got plenty of time for some more questions. So if you can refrain speaking or asking a question until you've got the microphone in front of you, and when you do get the microphone, just hold it steadily in front of your mouth like this, and then we should be able to hear you. So we've got John, we'll go for John first of all. Yeah.
Greg, thanks for a grand tour through the subject again. Very, very interesting. Very well presented. Herbert Spencer, to what degree did he lay an ethical groundwork for social Darwinism?
Now you've got me on the weak spot because I'm no philosopher, as you probably know, and he was a philosopher. He said a lot of peculiar things, you've got to admit, but some of it was quite crackpot. For example, he believed in laissez-faire capitalism because he said the companies that compete best will be the ones that survive and the other ones will go to the wall. And he had a lot of other peculiar ideas which I won't go into, particularly sexual type ideas, which are
yeah, I mean, just a supplementary, Greg. The thing is, it appears from my reading of history that he laid the groundwork for eugenics.
Yeah.
And more
that's one of the crackpot ideas, yeah.
Gave permission to our Teutonic cousins to live the Golden Rule.
Yes. That's why I guess he's not a household name like Darwin is.
Yeah.
I think what he said was just plain wrong.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Graham.
Could I suggest that I think we're missing the dark side of this?
Yeah.
If you're in a group, a family size, maybe less than 100 people in this valley, and there's another load on the valley over the hill.
Yes.
I know that even in modern society they say, well, he comes over the hill, oh, you kill him. That's what you do, you know.
Yes.
So it's moral.
Absolutely.
It's moral for me and my band to rape the women over there and kill the men. And that spreads the genes. So you need the rule of law to kill that.
Absolutely right. I said this actually when I gave the talk in to the philosophy group, because I just read a paper on specifically on that about that subject. And you're absolutely right. You put your finger on the spot there. Every society, every tribal group that we know of indulged in warfare, and they're the edict that you shouldn't kill people. You don't kill people of your own society, but it's okay to kill somebody in another society from the point of view of warfare. The question is though, why do we engage in warfare? Every society that we know engages in warfare. So what that does to me is it screams that it's got some sort of biological significance.
We want their valley and their resources so we can grow our genes into their valley.
No. Well, that might be the case. That might very well be the case. But this paper that I read came up with another explanation. And with all these things, I think there might be multiple explanations. But anyway, the explanation that I read was exactly what you put your finger on there. That when two tribes engage in warfare, the typical thing for the winner to do is to kill all the men and take the women off as sex slaves. Now, a society, hunter-gatherer society, has usually 300 or so individuals in. That presents a genetic problem because they're likely to end up inbred, and their gene pool is going to diminish and diminish and diminish. Okay, so they won't be able to be subject to natural selection. What warfare does is cure that problem, because when you take the women off from the other tribe, you get their genes, so they go into your gene pool. So you
and their valley.
Obviate the yes, but you obviate the problem of inbreeding. Yeah.
Okay, should we, Simon, I think had your hand up first of all, but I'll try and get to. Yeah, we've got two Simons, yeah. So as long as your name is Simon, we have Simon and then Simon. We've got lots of Johns, so if your name is John, you're a better chance as well.
So if our ethics have evolved and therefore contributed to our survival, why then are there so many different ethical frameworks on which to choose that actually conflict and compete with each other? I thought there would just been one.
I think that, to be honest, from what I've said then, is that morals, actually, basic morals, what's innate in people, are remarkably similar from one society to another. It's the third layer that you're talking about that's different. The layer that's put on top of it. If you look at what Muslims regard as moral behaviour, what Jews regard as moral behaviour, what Christians regard as moral behaviour, what humanists regard as moral behaviour, they're all very similar.
No, they're not.
But you put... they're only different in terms of what you put on top of it.
No.
and they all come from the same origin.
That's right.
I don't mean being human.
Can I
they all
enforce the
go back
rules,
to the
please?
Judaic.
Oh yes, but
hang on, I'm the chairman and I'm going to enforce the rule. I know I'm breaking the rule. I haven't got the microphone. But please wait till you get the microphone and then we can keep some order there. Thank you. Okay.
I was actually going to say at the beginning that some of you might have gone to the Darwin Day lecture. Was it last year? This year, 2018. Diana Fleischman gave the lecture. She's actually an evolutionary geneticist, scientist, so works on
And
evolutionary
we are
ethics.
getting her to our Darwin Day.
That's very good then.
Yes.
So you'll hear it again.
Let's. Okay. Let's go to Simon, then I will come over to this side, and we'll work our way back to the front here. Oh, he's asking you to use the.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Okay, so here's another question, and it's really about democracy, because when you were talking about the three levels, the three layers of morality, and we got to the one that's reasonable, where people use their brains and think and distinguish. Well, the next time we come to an election or a referendum, we're going to hear a mass of moral arguments, subtle stuff from both sides, and if only 10% or 12% of us are actually capable of responding to reason, what's the point of democracy?
You've put your finger on it. You can see that exactly that. For example, in the EU referendum, what was appealed to was people's baser innate behaviour, not so much what their reason and consciousness said. So they knew what they were doing, and these Russian propagandists on Facebook, they know exactly what they're doing. They're not appealing to reason; they're appealing to what's basic about people. You're quite right.
Let's start working from the back there, and then we'll come forward. So, Kathy.
This is probably a very simplistic question, but if rhesus monkeys innately feel that simply ethically someone else was hurt, how can people still hurt family members?
What? I didn't get that.
Can you try that again, Kathy? Because we couldn't hear.
You couldn't hear either. I tell you what.
We can't hear your mic very well. Oh, sorry.
Oh, we can hear you now.
I'll try here. Sorry. I said it's a very simple. Oh, it's working now. We need to hold close to your mic for it to work.
Yeah, I did say that.
I lost a question now. If you said that rhesus monkeys, when they see someone else hurt, they innately feel, how come you explain people hurt their families?
Great. No, leave that one there and come back. Yeah. Try and keep some order here.
Yeah, I think again, it's the same point as with the altruism. What we're talking about here is what's statistically significant. In other words, what occurs 95% of the time, not what occurs 5% or less of the time. Okay, so for natural selection to occur, people have got to do things that's going to be selected against as well. And that's, of course, you're not going to always get advantageous behaviour or behaviour that goes along with what you get 95% of the time.
Okay, who else had a hand up over here? Yeah, should we come to David then? David's next. David, put your hand up. No, David, that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. I was in the company of a biologist once, and his view, and I'd like your comment on it. I've got two comments to make. His view was that what we were was this thing with this large peristaltic tube inside us, and everything we did was to keep this peristaltic tube happy. So our eyes, our legs, our arms, all they are is functions to keep this tube satisfied with food. And we'll do anything, because if that tube, it drives us all the time.
Yeah, I think that's rather simplistic, isn't it? I don't know what sort of biologist you were You were talking to.
I'm asking for your comment.
Hunger is only one aspect of what drives
the
people.
interesting part to me as a scientist is that if we die within 30 minutes, the organisms inside that tube would start to consume us. We depend on tens of millions of E. coli inside there that just do functions for us.
But that's only one aspect. I mean, there are no bacteria in your brain usually. Plenty of viruses, incidentally, but no bacteria. Plenty in your gut. So, what you say is probably right, but it's only one aspect.
And can I just another? It's perhaps a little moral question. Some of you may remember. I think it was in the 70s. There was a document issued to all households called "Protect and Survive," and we had one.
Yes.
Now I knew that the man next door had a gun. Now, what should I do? And we did discuss this, and I sort of philosophised about this. What should I do? Should I wait till he comes to me, or should I go and kill him first?
You've got me out of my depth here because you're using your reason. You're not using your innate reaction. So I don't know. When you talk about that survive thing, the leaflet that you got, I was living in Ireland at that time. We got a leaflet through the letterbox from the government telling us what to do if Sellafield went wrong. So that was their version of a doomsday.
Okay, I know Paul is waiting, but let's just get Claire at the back there because...
Hello again. I'm just a little bit confused about the monkeys. I understand that with the child's innate behaviour that they might... well, I don't know, perhaps it's empathy, perhaps it's a need to please something, I don't know, but okay. I'm not sure, I'm just confused how the innate behaviour of the monkey is a proof of evolutionary ethics, because surely by starving yourself to save a fellow monkey, that if you're saying that's innate behaviour, how does that help natural selection?
I think what it's supposed to show is that monkey has regard for the other monkey, and it's trying to, if you like, get that monkey to survive as well as itself. That's what its innate behaviour is. The bit at the end, that was only because I wanted to refer to empathy towards animals rather than humans.
I was just wondering if you thought that the monkey might have any kind of reasoning ability that could potentially use the third part.
Probably not, but who knows? Just about everything that humans do is present in animals, but to a much lesser extent. I mean, I swear that my dog can reason, but it reasons in a very peculiar way. I don't know, to be honest, but that wasn't the point of the experiment. The point of that experiment was to show that a monkey would have regard for the life of another monkey. So, or not even the life in this case, it was just the fact that it was subjected to an unpleasant experience.
Okay, Paul's been waiting. Peter, do you want to get in as well?
Yeah, I have a chance, but I don't want to hog it because I've had a few shots.
Okay, well...
I think there's one factor that we seem to ignore, and that is that, quite honestly, humans today are very slightly civilised. We're we're scratching the surface.
Absolutely.
And, the sex side of it, for example, we're just trying to spread our genes. Otherwise, why is it that 54% of married men have affairs and 47% of married women have affairs?
Exactly.
They don't think, I'll have an affair.
Yeah.
It's an automatic drive that's built into us.
It's
the business of monogamy, well, if I was a lion and I kill something and I'm eating it and another animal comes up, I'd growl and drive him off because it's mine, right? And it's evolved through humanity, and the men are the same. She's mine. And so therefore they've made the rules to suit themselves. But basically, deep down underneath, there's that innate drive to spread your genes.
That's right.
And it's not something that we can really work out.
Well, I'm not going to.
It overpowers us, really.
I'm not going to argue with you because I agree with you completely.
Various people are saying it's excuses.
That is because they think they've got control of their emotions, and they haven't. Because the person that's happily married and he's falling along there, and he goes to a party, and there's a woman across the room, and for some reason, maybe pheromones or whatever, he finds her irresistible, right? He hasn't thought to himself, I'm going to find a woman who's irresistible.
Can I just tell you one thing that statisticians always tell me, and I've learnt in statistics, that you never deal with anecdotes because anecdotes are samples of one and they are completely insignificant.
Okay. Let's give Peter another crack.
So hands up all those that have had affairs in marriage.
Lynn wants confession time, but you can come to me for confession later on.
Thanks for letting me have another shot. I'd like to home in on this consciousness role, because I think to a certain extent you're underselling it, in the sense that we do not hold animals morally responsible for their behaviour. Now, or we don't punish them if they bite,
Used to in the Middle Ages.
But perhaps they did, but we don't do it now. And that's connected to my second point as well. So there may be an evolutionary foundation for what we call morality and ethics, but without something else, which I think you're putting in this third level of consciousness, we wouldn't have ethics. There has to be a level of rational application for something to be classified as moral. For example, we wouldn't call a behaviour that said, well, it's good for me to hit him, but it's bad for everybody else. In other words, moral behaviour has to have some degree of universalisability, or, you can't just have it for yourself and call it moral and deny everybody else that.
Yes, you're a philosopher by any chance?
I've read a little bit, but the other point connected to this, about the 20% and so on, if you look at writers like Steven Pinker, and I think we had a talk on him a while back, one of the things that he is attempting to show is that as our societies change, so people's deep feelings of a moral nature and the kinds of moral judgments that they make change over time. And we're not talking about evolutionary time here, we're talking about historical time. So from the Enlightenment in the 17th century, if you asked 90% of the people whether punishing X in this way or treating somebody like that was right or wrong, you get a very, very different answer from if you went out on the streets of Bournemouth today. And that's not because all the people in Bournemouth are suddenly becoming philosophers, but something has happened through societal development that changes people's moral judgments, and that's its historical time, not evolutionary time.
What I would say to that is that the basic tenets of morals and ethics are always the same. They don't evolve. They haven't changed with civilization. What I would put to you is Stephen Hawking's point. What you're doing is not offering me any evidence for what you say. I've given you loads of evidence. Can you give me experimental evidence? Can you give me statistical evidence?
I can give you
usually philosophers can't.
Anthropological, historical evidence. I mean, you were saying that all religions teach basically the same thing. I can give you lots of evidence that religions do not teach the same moral principles. For example, Islam allows, endorses and promotes violence of a variety of kinds. Jainism does none of these things. It is completely in favour of non-harming in thought, in word and in deed. There is no overlap in that area of their morals. And there are many other areas where there's no overlap either. In fact, there's a complete tension or contradiction even.
You can always reduce morals and ethics to basic patterns of behaviour in any religion, in any society. What you're talking about is something that's added on extra. Of course, that happens as well.
So which is added on, that you can harm other people or you can't?
Or
they both added
that's
on?
of course added on, because we do that in our own society. We let soldiers go out and kill people. That always happens.
Yeah.
I said that at the beginning.
So it can be moral to kill an out-group member? It can be moral, a good thing, a moral thing to kill a member of an out-group? That's what this gentleman was arguing over here.
I said that right at the beginning, that all these basic moral tenets are always modified. They are never absolute. If you say, for example, thou shalt not kill, it's in different societies that is modified, but it never becomes general. You can't go around killing people.
Can I Peter, thank you for the points you made. But let's go to another question. Karen, you had your hand up.
Thank you. I was just going to comment on the issue of empathy, actually, because I think it's quite interesting, the research that's been done on autism, which shows that there are neurological changes in the autistic brain, which kind of backs what you're saying about the fact that our capacity for empathy is neurologically stamped in us, so to speak. So we are a function of our brain, really, because the autistic brain is seen to be quite different, and people with autism find it difficult to read social messages, identify with another, read emotion, reflect on their own emotion, reflect on emotions in others. So it kind of is scientific evidence, really, that empathy is kind of ingrained in our neurological
Yes, you're quite right about autistic children. What you're talking about, though, is not the 95% majority, okay? But it's very interesting. A lot of experiments, or studies perhaps I should say, have been done on psychopaths as well. And they've shown that 2 areas of their brain are defective. So we're not talking about what happens in people who are unfortunately somehow defective. We're talking about what usually happens to ordinary people.
Okay, do we have any more? Yep, so, all right, let's go to the gentleman at the back there, and then I'll come back to John and Graham.
Hi, I'm just going to try and trump your monkey experiment or unethicity, can't really say that, unethical behaviour. But I heard about a monkey experiment where they gave mothers their babies, and they stood on a hot plate, and then they heated the hot plate. And that was just terrible, obviously done back in the 60s and 70s when all you guys were alive. But but basically they held these babies until it got really, really hot, and then they actually stood on the babies and saved themselves, the mothers. I suppose I just wanted to comment and see what that says about sort of altruism.
All right, what I gave you there was just sample snippets of evidence. There's a huge amount of evidence, and also, as you say, a huge amount of animal experiments. And as you say, animal experiments are part of this, I suppose, because 30 years ago you could do more or less what you like to monkeys, but now you are constrained over what you do in animal experiments. I know it because I did lots of animal experiments, and the rules have changed completely. And that's probably a good thing, but that's our brains, that's not our innate reaction.
But does that experiment kind of contradict the...
Oh, sorry, you were talking about... I'd have to...
say about what, say, monkeys...
Yeah, I'd have to look at the paper and the experiment.
I mean, I've only heard it secondhand, so it's not like it. But I just wondered what that might say about...
There's whole journals devoted to this, and huge amount of data and paper, so you know, you'd have to read what that particular paper was about. And I just don't know, I'm sorry.
Okay, we'll work our way back down the room. John, and then, sorry, Lisa. Yes, Lisa. John.
It's just a spontaneous question. I was thinking, the people who did the animal experiments, was that learned behaviour, or were they defective in some way?
Good point, yeah.
Okay. We'll go to Lisa.
I might be going off the point slightly, but I was interested in your mentioning about the changes in the psychopathic brain, and I just wondered whether that was thought to be a nature or a nurture thing.
Honestly, it's way out of my area. I just read in Science Alert that they'd found two areas of the brain connected with psychopathic behaviour. That's all I know. I haven't read the papers, so I honestly can't comment on that.
Sally, did you want to know?
The point I was going to make was very much the point that was just made down there.
It's been made. Okay. Should we go to John? We'll come back to you, Simon. John and then Graham.
Thanks for allowing me to run too, Greg. Memes. Memes. Dawkins' idea.
Oh, yeah. Old hat.
Can I have a go at trying to support his point of view? With the Golden Rule, it appears to be fairly universal. Quantitatively, you can find it in each society that progresses in in terms of civilisation. So the data is there.
Yeah.
How is that transmitted from generation to generation?
Well, I think Dawkins' idea in 1976 that gave rise to this mimetics business was that traits of behaviour were handed from one generation to the next, somehow were passed on like genes were, but they weren't actually genes, if you see what I mean. That's been really quite severely criticised, and people have labelled it all kinds of things. What I think people do accept now is that, or most people do, in science, nobody always accepts everything, but what I think is the generally held view now is that patterns of learned behaviour can be passed on from one generation to the next, and that just like what's determined by your genes, they can also be the subject of natural selection.
Which is Dawkins' point.
Yes.
So is the word meme useful?
Nobody uses it anymore because his original idea that these things.
If you put it closer to your mouth, I'm struggling with a.
Okay. What he was saying was that these patterns of behaviour somehow went from one person to the next, and he didn't mention learning. He mentioned that he thought that they were just kind of transmitted in some sort of mysterious way. And what was questioned?
That's rubbish. Sorry.
Okay, Sally, we'll take this on. Let's hang on, Sally. You can have the mic, Sally. And
yeah, sorry.
That's not at all what he was saying. I mean, his point was that ideas could be naturally selected.
That's right, yeah.
But that's nothing to do with it being passed on somehow mysteriously or anything like that. He's saying some ideas ideas are in competition with rival ideas.
The problem was that you're quite right about the basic concept, but the problem with it was, and why mimetics never got off the ground, was that he likened it to genes, and he said that these patterns of behaviour were somehow inherited from one individual to the next in a similar manner.
That isn't what he was saying.
No,
he was saying it's transmitted from people to people. No, that's a different thing from inheritance.
We're just using two different terms. All right.
I'm saying you're wrong. The point he was making was that ideas undergo natural selection, just as.
Hold on, you're not big enough. You're using the wrong terminology now. It wasn't ideas, it was patterns of behaviour. It was patterns of behaviour, and I used the wrong term. I shouldn't have used the wrong term.
No, I don't think that's. I think a meme, as Dawkins understood it, was a much wider thing than just patterns of behaviour. It was also ideas. I have read The Selfish Gene a number of times.
It's probably 20 years since I read that book, so I can't really recall. You may be right, but I'm only telling you. Okay, I'll tell you what's accepted now by most people is that the patterns of behaviour are learned. They're nothing to do with being transmitted automatically from one generation to the next. They're learned.
Automatically. No.
Okay, let's move on. We've just got not much time left. I know Graham was waiting, and Mike's been waiting for a long time. So let's go to Mike. Maureen, I've noticed. Simon. Okay.
Thank you. So I would agree with Sally on the subject of memes. I don't think it's a dead end either. I think that in actual fact, memetics is alive and well in the world of social media.
Oh yes, I agree with you there.
Well, then it's not dead, is it? And the whole point is, it's actually central. It's actually central to things like sort of viral. Looking at you, sort of talking about virology, but. In terms of viral messages, for example.
What the problem was that he had no evidence for it.
No, it's developed, hasn't it? It's not the same as perhaps it was originally. But nowadays, you can't say memetics is dead, because I know it's not. It's actually it's absolutely central.
People don't use the term memes anymore.
They do. They do. They absolutely do. They may not in the areas, the sort of lofty areas you may.
I've not seen it used in the science literature for about.
Well, okay, but in the real world, they are.
Okay, can we get off memes then? Maureen, are you going to talk about memes or something else?
Something about Nick. I find the concept of memes really interesting.
We try and keep off memes.
I just wanted to throw to the pot that because these rhesus monkeys might have been very good, but there's lots of monkeys.
Can't hear you. Can't hear.
I can't hear. So.
There's monkeys that do eat each other, and we of course have cannibalism, and also just things like how lots of girls are being killed across, certain countries like China when it's been astute to do so.
Yes.
And genocides, of course, of certain faiths, and even children being disabled because of the need to, because of hunger and so forth. So I'm just really interested in the concept of this meme thing, but I just wanted to throw that other stuff into the pot because there's a huge chasm of behaviour where monkeys, humans kill, make their children hungry, hit them, beat them across the world, it seems to me.
It's the same as this gentleman here was saying. What you're saying is that moral behaviour, and you're again talking about that you shouldn't kill people, it's always modified, and you're giving a load of instances of where it's modified. I agree with you completely. Of course it's modified. But the basic tenet is still there.
Let's give Simon another bite of the cherry, and then we will come to you, Graham, and then Mike will be the last one.
I just wanted to ask you again about the monkey altruism experiment, and ask you why.
I'm not sure whether that was altruism, but anyway, go on.
Wasn't it? It was the one where they're electrocuting the monkey, and the other monkey decided to. Empathy, right. But does it necessarily suggest that the causal relationship is from altruism, or it could be just that screams at the monkey, puts it off its food? I mean, for instance.
Absolutely, and that's why I gave you 5 examples of experiments that were done, which are part of a whole huge amount of evidence, experiments done in different ways, observations made in different ways. They were only to give you a flavour as to what kind of experiments are done. That wasn't. That was one of a huge number of different experiments that's been done to show the same point. The second one I gave was another experiment really that showed the same point. But there's a huge number, lots of different experiments being done that you can find in the literature. I couldn't cover them all tonight, obviously I could just cover the conclusions, but what I wanted to do was show you some of the experiments that were done in a sort of a way that I can understand anyway. Some of those experiments are very complicated.
Great.
Let's come back to the charity one.
Yeah.
Dawkins used to talk about charitable lust, like sexual lust, and that this charitable gene is in all of us. And I want to say, in general, we should take deep time into account. We keep talking about things that have happened in the last 10,000 years. Go back to the millions of years when we were all in small bands, and everybody was related, everybody shared our genes, and charitable lust to help the poor man in our group was what did it. Now we can see Africans in trouble, and that charitable gene is misfiring, as Dawkins
So
said.
it's, if you like, a kind of substitute. You're doing something that you would have done for something that was close to you, but it's somebody far away. Yeah.
You see them in trouble, and you put it out.
But I agree with you completely. You should look at what happens in the 95% that we were more actually, that we were hunter-gatherers, rather than the last 10,000 years. Absolutely.
I just wanted to make the point that it sort of went on from what Paul said earlier. The whole thing about charity and so on is very much a luxury, and if we're in a very comfortable position, then we can be charitable. But in situations where we have to fight, flight, freeze, it's the amygdala that kicks in, and there's nothing to do with reason at all.
Absolutely.
And the veneer of civilization is so microscopically thin, and all you have to look at is a car park with one space and two people looking through it. And actually, in terms of evidence, 2 weeks ago, down at Dirty Chine, this exactly happened. There were two blokes fighting over a car parking space, and the police had to be called. So don't really talk to me about civilization. I think I'd rather live with the apes.
I agree with you completely. The impression that I've got no evidence for this at all. The impression I get is that when people drive, they lose their inhibitions as well in terms of the way they behave.
Okay, we need to start wrapping things up. Will you please give Greg another big round of applause? Just a few notices, and then I'll let you go for a drink or whatever you want to do.